Mahalo Lele, and welcome everyone to another live digital kava session here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast. Today, I will be a lone ranger for our live digital kava session today. Mr. Atearoa was here in the United States a week or so ago, and so we spent the majority of the time there. We did release a new episode on the podcast just from a previous live digital kava session, but it's been a couple weeks since we've had a full blown live. So, despite the family obligations that Mr. Atearoa has, we thought it was necessary just to jump on, get through another live digital kava session here, and really have a discussion on a topic that I think is important to understand. We'll be spending some time to walk through the Polynesian language, family tree, language chart, whatever you want to call it. Want to review some of the discussions that I've seen online regarding um, Polynesian language structure and certain conclusions that people take from it. There's a specific video that we'll react to um, that we were tagged on, and some of the discussion online has been quote unquote evidence of more influence throughout Polynesia. Once again, we're not trying to get into a tit for tat. We're really just having a discussion on our history, trying to get a better understanding of our origins, what we were in regards to the culture, the structure of our ancestors from thousands of years ago. It's really important to understand that what that structure looked like. There's a lot of discussions we hear online, and in speeches that, we're one people, which we believe in 100% here on the podcast. But the question becomes, well, if we're one people, where did we come from? Where did our ancestors get this knowledge, this technology? Where did the kingly structure of government come from? Where did the religious aspects of Hikuleo come from? And all of those things that lead us to understand who and what we are. Um, Looks like we have an early comment here from Josh E. Melanesia. I'm assuming that you're kind of responding of where that origin comes from. Josh, that is a very common response that we get, and I understand that the academics push that out as a Southeast Asian migration through Melanesia, then to Polynesia. And we can't argue with the DNA. There's definitely Melanesian DNA, even though the majority of the DNA is Southeast Asian. They've done some of the intense studies, Josh, into the patriarchal DNA strains, the Y, and also the mitochondria. It's overly dominant that the mitochondria is from Southeast Asia, and some of the Y chromosomes or that DNA comes from Melanesia. However, Josh, with that being said, the challenge that we have here is genetic material does not explain the origins of ideas. And I'll explain it to it this way, Josh. If you come to America and you'll find certain genetic materials, that doesn't necessarily give you the origin of the phenomena that's known as the United States, right? What made the United States unique? What, the first experiment into um, democracy, self-governance, the Constitution of the United States, the three branches of government, and how each branch has its own roles and responsibilities, free market, economics, military, infrastructure, technology. Genetic material doesn't explain that. So we recognize that there is genetic material through Southeast Asia, through Melanesia. But once again, what we're kind of leaning towards is we see that, but we want to understand where the ideas came from. Where did the idea of kings come from? Where did the idea of mound building come from? Where did the idea of religious structure and how astronomical knowledge and religious knowledge was infused into the politics of Polynesia that spread throughout the area? So that's what we're kind of leaning towards, Josh. We understand that, there is definitely a Melanesian tie, but we're trying to go beyond that. So, hey, T Style, welcome, welcome. T Style says we only connect with Austronesian through languages, genetics. Maybe that's where we're kind of leaning to. We obviously inherited certain words, certain cultural practices, but when we get to the core, and then we'll even look at the Austronesian languages here, T Style, they're really in the Proto-Polynesian, and it spreads out from Melanesian. It doesn't really, there's a huge distinction between our linguistical structure with the Melanesian one. So yeah, let's see here. Water Bears, Malo Malo. He says none of your ops want to see you live face to face. Two are too scared to show face and share their bizarre ideas. Hey, I am by no means Water Bear claim that all my ideas are unconquerable, right? No one has a perfect record with their ideas. I've had some bad ideas, but I don't have a problem with some of my ideas getting choked out if they don't deserve to win, right? And I don't have an issue with that. However, I am very confident in some of the ideas that I have developed. And those ideas, I'm kind of excited to see them compete. And like you said, I mean, I've consistently invited people who support us, people who criticize us, people who've never heard of us, people who just have a life story. We'll bring them to the table, have those conversations. I don't oppose that. I mean, really, we're not interested in having a debate, so to speak, in an official manner where there's a rebuttal and so forth. People have said things on the podcast that I don't necessarily agree with, but that's fine, right? That's them showing their style, their technique, the competitiveness of their idea. We allow that to be fleshed out as much as possible so that the viewers, the listeners, can see it, can hopefully understand it, and then say, how does that idea compare to this one? Right? It's no different than when we watch a UFC or a boxing match. Some people score each round differently. Some people value different things differently. Some people, I'm definitely much more of a Pacquiao believer. Mr. Atearoa is much more of a, since he's not here to defend himself, he's much more of a runaway Mayweather fan. But hey, everybody sees it differently. And our goal is just the more we talk about it, the better chance that the good ideas rise to the top, and the better it is that the bad ideas die. And both are important, right? A good idea rising to the top is just as important as a bad idea just getting drowned and we move on, because bad ideas lead to bad actions and bad beliefs. So appreciate that, Water Bears. Looks like T Style has a question here. He says, question, if we were to follow the mound building, would that lead us back to Egypt, or do we collectively figure this out? I mean, the interesting thing, T Style, about the mound building, it does lead back to Egypt, but it also leads to all around the world. That's one of the things that's kind of intriguing about the mound building is you find them in specific areas around the world, all around the world, right? Like throughout the United States, you find them in certain parts of Africa. You find them, you can make the argument. You also find some of them in kind of the Southeast Asia, but there's distinct styles to each of them. One of the things that's kind of unique about the mound building structure and stylistic that, Polynesia tends to have with the Americas is earth based mound building, and then also some rock based. And then there's a mixture of that. There seems to be a transition there, but that's kind of the interesting thing. And that's, I think we severely underestimate how fluid the movement of our ancestors were, and actually how technologically advanced our ancestors were. We think we're the only ones that have this cool technology and we were mobile around the earth. I think we highly underestimate how mobile our ancestors were. There's a lot of talk of the Vikings coming to the Americas well before the Europeans. We also have some evidence of the Chinese making it to the Americas, the Phoenicians. There's a lot of people. Right now we're kind of in the dominant Western civilization. So really history reflects and overly, I don't want to say overly, but it highly tends to fall towards a bias towards the West. I am by no means saying West is evil. No, the West has brought some great things. We take those good things, but we also recognize the West is the youngest civilization. It just happens to be the one that matters the most in our days now because that's the most influential. Josh here says, "Where's Maui?" Are you speaking about the individual or location? If you're speaking about Maui, I have no problem saying my bias. He's the majority of his descendants and heirs are on Tongatapu and in Tonga, but there's a reason why the Ha'amonga Maui is built on Tongatapu and not anywhere else. So that's kind of my response to that. Water Bear says Maui's in Motunui. Interesting, very interesting. Maui and Motunui with Hey Hey. Tony from Facebook. Can you react to a video about Tonga on Plus 64 channel and give us your thoughts? Tony, we did have a response. If you're referring to Plus 64 regards to Christianity and Tonga being forced to take Christianity, we do have a response to that. We haven't edited that live digital kava session into a actual episode on the podcast. Our most recent episode is the first half of the live digital kava session that leads up just before we start reacting to that video. I would probably say our next podcast episode or playlist will be that video, Tony. So if you subscribe to our podcast, you will eventually see that. That's probably going to be our next episode on the podcast. Or you could just search it through. I apologize. We don't name our live digital kava sessions. We just date them. But if you go back 2 or 3 kava sessions, you'll find that video as well. We talk about, in that podcast, we talk about religion, Polynesians, and then we slowly migrate into that Plus 64 with the Samoan brother who played rugby for Manu Samoa, who's the lawyer. We did respond to that. So take a look at that, Tony, real quick. Josh says, not Maui, Maui in your pad. Okay. Maui Tegelangi was here in the States as well. He's in Aotearoa. He is with Mr. Aotearoa in Wellington as we speak. They're over there kind of working on a family celebration. So that's where he is, Josh. Just a heads up on that. Mataafa, Malay Tua. Look forward to today's discussion. Mataafa, as always, great to see you here at the Digital Kava session. Welcome, welcome. And Nonsky says, Malo Tua. Malo Nonsky, welcome. All right, guys. Let's jump in to our first part of the show today. So the first part of the show today, we're going to react to a video. Let me see here if I can find it. We're going to react to a video that has made some rounds online. And this video has been presented as quote unquote evidence of a, let's just put it this way, a empire outside of the Tongan Empire and influence that we're going to walk through. And this is where, some of my biggest criticisms of some of the ideas out there is they do a single layer analysis, and then they make these rapid conclusions that say, see, Tonga was nothing, right? Tonga was nothing because look at the language structure and how Tongic is isolated by itself with just Niue, and then you have the nuclear Polynesian language um, that has Samoa, and it also has Eastern Polynesia, and then they say, see, here's the assumption. And then there's the conclusion that, oh, okay, that doesn't make sense, because a lot of the Tongan, this lady who's going to speak in the video, she's going to ask a question, because Tongan oral history and many oral histories out there says, well, why does that doesn't make sense? The only, I don't want to say the only, because we're all human, nobody knows everything, but the only empire that really has significant evidence behind it is the Tuitonga Empire. There are, granted, there are other oral histories out there. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is there's also a very strong oral history on the Tuitonga Empire, and then physical ruins throughout, and then recorded history as the Europeans were coming in to Polynesia. They recorded certain rituals, certain gatherings on Tongatapu to the Tuitonga that enters recorded history, even at the Tuitonga Empire's lowest point, right? Like when they came into Polynesia, the Tuitonga Empire was at its lowest point. It was in decline. Civil war was either brewing or actively engaged on Tongatapu and Tonga as a whole. And so once you have that instability at the capital of the empire, everything shrinks, contact and structure dissolves, no different than any other modern nation who goes through a civil war, and the formal government is either dissolved or fractured, and then everybody's just going into survival mode. So with that being said, we're gonna look at this video and just have a quick reaction. And once again, this is a prime example. We have the academics here. We have multiple academics, Polynesian and specifically Tongan academics who are presenting this. And then that gives this credence to this idea that, quote unquote, even Tongan history and Tongan academics are unified in presenting this concept. But it's kind of just it's a weak way. This is why it's important to have conversations. And let's look at this from History Fanatic, and it says the more you delve deep into the history, the more you start to realize that it was not the Tongans who conquered the Pacific, but it was the Samoans. Talatau Tonga, Talatofi Samoa. I'm assuming that's some kind of proverb, right? Now, once again, this is the thing that we're going to walk through, right? And we're going to just respond. So they're basically saying that this structure of the Proto-Polynesian languages is evidence that Tonga did not have an empire, and that it was actually a Samoa empire, which, the most potential one to have an impact would be the Tu'imanua. But let's kind of take a look at this, and then we'll continue.
Thank you. I just looked
let's
question
get it to the
here,
video.
Melanite from Maunga Koloa, Whalewai.
Thank you. I just looking at her presentation and seeing the beginning of her chart, that it has to the Proto-Polynesian and the Samoic. So
we're going to pause it right there because I think that's important. Let's share this one. And this is the chart that she's referring to, right? So we see the chart here, and it goes the Polynesian, the Proto-Polynesian, and then it splits into two groups. One is the Tongic, right? And it's, as you can see, this is a very short tree. It just goes from the Tongic. There's only two branches under the Tongic, and that's the Tongan and the Niuean branch. On the other side of that, you have the nuclear Polynesian language. In that language, you have two branches. the Samoic outlier, and then you have the Eastern Polynesian. In the Samoic outlier, there's the Samoan, Elise, Tokelauan, Tikopian, and even Futuan, right? Which is kind of interesting because I've listened to the Futuna languages and so forth. It's kind of interesting. That seems a lot closer to me than even Samoan. But anyways, then we have the Eastern Polynesian, and that's where you have Rarotongan, Tahitian, Maori, Tuamotuan, and Hawaiian. So kind of your stereotypical Eastern Polynesians. But she's kind of referring to, hey, look at this huge family tree, right, of languages, and then the Tongic language right here. And so now we can see the assumption that's made by the person who created the video. They say, oh, look, this is the Samoan Empire, right? That's what makes sense here. Tongans didn't do anything. And just for anyone out there, okay, I have a lot of Samoan blood, Tongan, and even Fijian blood. So this is not, oh, somehow I only care about Tonga. Hey, dude, we're all one people. We're all the same people. So want to just get that out of the way, because you always get someone who's like, oh, this, or that. No, we're just, once again, we want to have the conversation. And two, we want to make sure that the ideas that we're discussing are the strongest ideas. And if we have a bad idea, kill it. The sooner a bad idea dies, the better. We can learn from the bad ideas. It may bring one or two good things, but at the core, it may be a weak idea. And if at the core it's a weak idea, we need to just slice, dice it, take whatever's good and move on. So let's come back to the video. So that's what she's referring to in the video.
I was wondering why was the Tongan was going down only one, and here the Samoic has all the networking of different languages, total languages. But Tonga was seen to be the warriors of the Pacific. And there's a connection of taking the language. But that's Dr. Taumoi Folau. I think I need to go back and review your presentation, because I think it has some connection. I'm wondering why the Tongan was just one going down and not onto many others like the Samoic.
See right there, we go back just
going down.
Go back just a little bit.
I think it has some connection. I'm wondering why the Tongan was just one going down and not onto many others like the Samoic, Tahitian. All the other Polynesian parts have all the languages. So I'm just wondering why Tonga has, maybe they were too dominant or whatever. That's my question. I wonder why was it going down on one, as I look at your chart, and the other ones, many. That's my question. Thank you, Dr. Taumoi Folau.
Yeah, I think she's talking about only the Niue is the one that comes through the Tongic, versus the Samoic has multiple languages that derive from it. So we'll turn the time over to you, Dr. Taumoi Folau, for answer.
Malau pito maunga. The building of the chart of the subgroups is based on a comparison of all the modern languages. So Samoan is more similar, share more cognates with the rest of the other Polynesian languages. And that's the reason why, and we distinguish Maunga between cognates, which are the inherited forms, and the borrowed words, words that, and I think you will find that Tongan language has lots and lots of words borrowed by other languages, which indicates that they had been around. You know what I mean? Yeah. Okay, Maunga, I hope that answers your question.
And then it goes into, this video continues into that whole concept there of somehow, see, once again, I want to come back to the concept here of somehow this whole language thing is diminishes from the Tongan Empire, which it doesn't, in my opinion. That's what we're going to spend time here today, kind of walking through and discussing that. So don't want to get too far from some of the comments here. It says Futuna and Tokelau sounds more similar to Tongan. Yeah, I would agree. It does sound pretty similar. Here's an interesting comment here. We need to stop saying Pacific. Tui Tonga and Manua never made it to East Polynesia. That's, there's a reason why we share the same language and the same religion and a lot of similar customs. That was the last areas to be populated and influenced by the Polynesians. I agree in not saying Pacific because we weren't involved throughout the Pacific. Melanesia and Micronesia have their own unique sets of culture and religion and so forth, with some influence cross-Polynesian with Polynesian, but the Polynesian Triangle has some very specific aspects that unites us across the board. You also say that the original language is very Samoic outlier. We're going to get into that, Josh. We're going to get into that. We're going to dive into that a little bit more. It's Dendis says, I don't think Tonga had to conquer anyone because they were descendants of the founders of the whole. I'm open to that, Dendis. I kind of lean towards that. Now, does that mean there weren't some scuffles here and there? No, there were, but for all intents and purposes, there was a unification under it. I am open to the idea, though, Dendis, that there may have been, and I'll explain this idea a little bit more before we get into the languages a little bit more. I am open to the idea that there may have been people already populated on the islands, right? And what could be one of the scenarios that could explain what happened is that Tangaloa, Maui, and the Taulas, they come into the Pacific or to Polynesia, and it's already populated. That's where you get all this Southeast Asian blood. That's where you get a lot of this Melanesian blood. But Maui, Tangaloa, and the Taulas come. They're an outside civilization from the mound building civilization. They establish themselves on Tongatapu, and then they spread. So they are the core group. I commonly refer to them as the founding fathers of the Polynesian Empire. And I don't feel that they had to go around and conquer. I believe that they brought superior technology, a very structured way to organize government and religion. And then through exploration and colonizing of the islands, so to speak, and intermarrying into leading families throughout the Polynesian islands, they established a network of the kingdom that eventually led to a structure of governors and lower kings throughout the different islands that had a connection to Tongatapu, and therefore drove the government, the religion, the culture that is now known as Polynesian. So that's kind of my thoughts on that as well. I don't disagree. Don't disagree, Josh. Yeah, Pacific. Probably, yeah, it's thousands of islands. I don't disagree with that. Let me see here. Nonsky says it's definitely clear when you see these people and their assumptions, nothing clear at all, just there's muddy to muddy the water. I agree. But that's the thing. They muddy the waters and then they say, oh, see, this means this. No, you have to actually sit down and have some conversations and walk through some of these ideas. Let's see here. Renegade says Samoans migrated to a lot of islands. Later on, Tonga's language is similar to more islands than just Niue. I would agree with that, but the academics and the science behind it, I'm sure they have their structuring reasons, and we'll kind of walk through some of those. but that's just the way they've decided to structure it. But even Renegade, even in the way that they structure it, there's different ways to interpret the data, and it doesn't just lean one way. And actually, even the data they provide makes room and actually gives some credence to the Tuitonga Empire, and there's some ways to explain the differences. So, with that being said, appreciate the comments. Couldn't get to all of them, but we're going to walk through. So, we had our good buddy, Mr. Grok himself, Super Grok, do some analysis. And we ran two scenarios. We did the deep search, and then we also did the thinking critically. And we ran through both of those. So here it went through 36 sources. And basically, we asked Grok and said, Grok, how should I understand the relationship of the Tongic language from Tonga in relation to the Samoic language from Samoa and the rest of Polynesia in regards to which language is older and how they interacted with each other and any other patterns to understand how the languages developed? So we asked Grok. I don't care what anyone says. Some people, it's kind of silly. The same people who say, Grok and AI is kind of silly to use, but then they'll go and search Google and read some crazy stuff as well. So I'm a big fan of using AI. It tends to be more logical. It covers, look at all the data sources here that it goes through. AI has passed the LSAT, GMAT, passed the bar. A lot of these AIs are pretty smart. You got to be wise with it. It doesn't mean everything the AI says is 100%, gold. You still got to use some critical thinking. And like some here I'm seeing in the comments, use the data online. But guys, that's fair, and we'll walk through it. So we're just going to walk through some of the data points. So the key points that Grok's going to come up with. It says research suggests Tongic or Tongan and Samoan languages diverge from the Proto-Polynesian around 2,500 years ago. So neither is definitely older. And then the next point, it says, it seems likely that historical interactions, especially Tongan dominance, led to language contact with Tongan influencing Samoan through loan words, right? Then it says, the evidence leans towards both languages sharing many similarities but being distinct, with Tongan retaining some archaic features like the glottal stop. So I want to just walk through those 3 points. So pretty much it's saying they have the same origin. Looks like the Tongan language has more loan words given to the other languages, right? But then it also shows here the evidence leans towards both languages sharing many similarities, but being distinct, with Tongan retaining some archaic features like the glottal stop. So that to me is very interesting. The question that comes to my mind is, why? Why did the Tongan language maintain more of the archaic forms of the language? And I think that's important. I think that's something we need to keep in mind as we go through this. That's a fair question. They seem to be of similar origins. Neither one is older than the other, but somehow they've diverged. What caused the diversion? Obviously the video we saw says, it's because there was a Samoan empire. But when you look at oral history, you look at ruins, you look at even recorded history, very little evidence for that. We have a little bit more for the Tongan Empire. But I think the fact that they're saying that the Tongan language retains more of the archaic forms of the Proto-Polynesian language is really important. So we'll go through the first part. It says, language, age, and relationship. Both Tongic and Samoic languages are part of the Polynesian family, which originated from Proto-Polynesian spoken in the Tonga Samoa area. They split around the same time, so it's not accurate to say one is older than the other. Instead, they developed in parallel, with Tongic, including Tongan and Niuean, and Samoic being part of the larger nuclear Polynesian branch, which also includes East Polynesia languages like Hawaiian and Maori. Okay. Something that's kind of interesting there, right? Um, especially when you say the Hawaiian and the Maori, those are two languages. Well, Hawaiian was basically died for all intents and purposes as a language, had to be resurrected. And then the Maori either came very close to dying and had to be resurrected, but both came either close to death or died as a language. And I think that there's some reasoning behind how this whole separate group of the language morphed. But they come from the same origin and they developed in parallel. Historical interaction. It says here historical interaction and influence. Historical record shows significant contact, particularly during the Tu'itonga Empire's influence over Samoa, which likely led to Tongan loan words in Samoan, such as alu, walk. This suggests Tongan had a cultural and linguistic impact during periods of dominance through Samoa later regained independence, potentially reducing direct influence. Okay. We're not going to go through this whole idea of Samoa gaining independence. We will have a future episode that talks about the Tuna and Fata whole situation there. But we're just talking about the language. So these two languages split, but then and they're developing in parallel, and then they're saying one language had dominance over the other and has loan words. But that's the interesting thing. If that's the case, then that means the whole Samoic string of languages have borrowed words from the Tongic string of languages. And we don't necessarily have the reverse of that. It seems to be more one way, which once again is another evidence that lean towards dominance of the Tu'itonga Empire, which is wildly accepted across the board. Let's see here. Development patterns. Both languages share vocabulary and grammar due to their common origin, but they have distinct features. Tongan retains the glottal stop, the whakaua, right? A feature lost. See, we're starting to see this. As we mentioned earlier with the Maori and the Hawaiian language here, right? So lot of influence there. It says that the feature lost in many of the other Polynesian languages, while both merge certain words like R and L into L. These differences highlight their unique evolutionary paths within Polynesia. Okay. The question is, once again, this is arising as to what was the different paths that we're talking about here. So they're evolving, especially with the concept of, do we believe our ancestors were migrating back and forth for many, many thousands of years, or do we believe that was not the case? We will continue down here. Survey note, understanding the relationship between Tongic and Samoan languages in Polynesia. This survey note provides a comprehensive analysis of the relationship between the Tongic language from Tonga and the Samoic language from Samoa, focusing on their age, historical interactions, and patterns of development within the broader Polynesian linguistic context. The discussion is informed by historical, archaeological, and linguistic evidence aiming to address the user's query in detail. Okay. Linguistic classification and age. The Polynesian languages are a subgroup of the Austronesian language family, with Tongic and Samoic representing two key branches. According to linguistic studies, the ancestors of modern Polynesia settled in the Tonga Samoa area around 3,000 years ago. So this is kind of the common theme when you're looking around throughout Polynesia in the history and origins. It seems to be pretty uniform across the board. Everyone agrees Tonga Samoa is the kind of the origin areas. Now, as of recent, the Samoan cradle of Polynesia seems to have gotten more attention as of the recent years. a lot of our perspectives diverges from that. We don't think there's a lot of evidence besides oral history that supports that position. But hey, we're here to discuss and explore that as much as we can. Undergoing common development for about 1,000 years, leading to Proto-Polynesian, the ancestor of all modern Polynesian languages. Okay, so this is something that I think is important. So there was a unified language for they're saying at least 1,000 years. Okay, then there's a split, and they're saying that the Tongic language is truer to the archaic form of the Proto-Polynesian than the Samoic languages. I translate that as Tongic is truer to the original Proto-Polynesian language than the Samoic ones. As they were unified for 1,000 years, they split. Then there is a radical change. The Tongic remains truer to the original Proto-Polynesian language, while the Samoic one goes through a more radical change. Question is, what's causing the differentiation there? Right? And so that's something that I think is really important. We're starting to see a theme here. Tongic language maintains its archaic form a lot better than the Samoic branch. And we'll kind of, get through some of my thoughts on that and visit some of the comments here as we get through. Around 2,500 years ago, Proto-Polynesian began to split, giving rise to two main branches. Tongic, comprising of Tongan and Niue, this branch is considered more conservative, retaining certain archaic features of Proto-Polynesian, such as the glottal stop, which many other Polynesian languages, including Samoan, have lost. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this over and over again. Proto-Polynesian language, 1,000 years, and the dates and the timelines may be wrong. I think it was much longer than that, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll keep it to their timelines. 1,000 years of unified language. At some point, it splits. When the split happens, Tongic remains more of the archaic features and is more conservative, reflecting the older Proto-Polynesian language structure. The Samoic side starts to lose some of the archaic features of the Proto-Polynesian language. Okay, I think that's important. This is not Samoan language was more dominant, that's why there's more. No. It's actually the other way around. The borrowed words are more on the Samoic side, borrowing from the Tongic side, not the other way around. And they express those loan words because of Tongic dominance of the Tu'itonga Empire. So those are two really important things. The borrowing of the word seems to be one way, and the remaining true to the Proto-Polynesian language is on the Tongic side. Okay, so I think that's something that's really important to keep track of. Okay, on the nuclear Polynesian, that's where the Samoic language comes from. Include Samoan and all other Polynesian languages, further dividing into subgroups like Samoic Outlier and Eastern Polynesian. This branch has undergone more diversification, suggesting a broader spread and evolution. I'm going to come back to this. The nuclear Polynesian that has the Samoic and the Eastern Polynesian, what do they say is the driving feature for it? This branch has undergone more diversification, broader spread, and evolution. There is a rapid change in the language. That is what is driving that. The rapid change in the language. Now, why is it? Now let's just come back to this. Historically speaking, when we look at our ancestors, what was the big split? what is the biggest cause of change and diversification of history, governance, maintaining of social and ancient structures like language, not just language, but also cultural practices? We can't help but think there's only one of these groups that maintained independence from the very beginning. All of our other brothers and sisters had gone through a more rapid and radical change. We know we're talking about the language, but when we zoom out, radical change in political structure, religious structure, cultural structure, all driven by colonization. Okay. That is what I am starting to see as the driver behind the diversification and the evolution of these languages. Right? So, no, the groupings, the reason why it's a bigger grouping of languages is not because, oh, it was Samoic dominance and colonization within the Polynesian groups. No, 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 no. It seems like this is more along rapid change. And the change that we can think of that we have documented for sure historically is colonization. That's what we see. So, yeah, that's what I'm kind of when we go through this whole thing, it actually, to me, one could make the argument that the linguistical structure further validates the Tu'itonga Empire's influence, because the borrowed words are one-dimensional from the Tongic to the nuclear Polynesian, which has Samoic and Eastern Polynesia. The borrowing of the words is one-way street, and then one side maintained its independence and its truthfulness closer to the Proto-Polynesian ancestral language. All right, let's continue here. Given this timeline, neither Tongan nor Samoan is older than the other, as both diverged from the Proto-Polynesian simultaneously. However, Tongic's smaller size, only in 2 languages, contrasts with nuclear Polynesian's extensive diversification, which might suggest different rates of linguistic evolution, but not age. Let's see here. Seeing a lot of comments here. I'm going to try and power through this without getting too distracted. But once again, the diversification and the radical changes of the linguistical side of things is actually the driver and the explanation for the changes in the languages. Historical interaction and language contact. Historical interactions between Tonga and Samoa have significantly shaped their linguistic relationship. Samoan oral traditions suggest that Tonga was once under the dominion of the Tu'imanua. Yeah, okay. All right. We're going to keep it in there. We're having a different conversation, but, paying tribute. But by the 10th century, the Tu'itonga Empire supplanted this, exerting influence over Samoa. In the 13th century, the Tu'itonga Talakai Faiki brought Samoa under direct control, establishing a capital at Safotu in Savaii, but was later expelled by the progenitors of the Malietoa dynasty, leading to Samoa's independence. Despite this, intermarriages between the Tongan and Samoan chiefly lines continued, as seen with Ngata, the progenitor of the current Tonga royal dynasty, Tu'ikanukupolu being of Samoan descent. Well, I mean, here's a comment right here, right? Oh, now you read that you don't believe it, shaking my head. You pick and choose what you want to believe. I pick and choose across the board. Okay. And anyone who says they don't pick and choose, it doesn't. This is we don't have a lot of physical evidence. The reason why I shake my head, very little physical evidence for this. So that's the reason why. But like I said, we don't want to get too distracted by that. But anyways, we'll continue here. We can have that conversation once we get through this if we want to, easy. This historical contact is reflected in linguistic evidence. Studies such as those by Paul Gerardi identify Tongan loanwords in Samoan, such as alu, indicating that during periods of Tongan dominance, there was significant language contact with Tongan influencing Samoan. Additionally, Tongan names for Samoan words like kokupolu or upolu suggest long-term familiarity and interaction, potentially facilitating lexical borrowing. All right. Yeah. I mean, let me put it this way, there's a lot of different things here that I don't necessarily agree with, but the overall concept we're going to allow here just to get through the idea here. Patterns in language development. The development of the Tongic and Samoic languages shows both shared and distinct patterns reflecting their common origin and subsequent divergence. Phonetical features. Both Tongan and Samoan are part of the West Polynesian subgroup, where Proto-Polynesian R and L merged into L, unlike East Polynesian languages, which often use R. Tongan, however, retained the glottal stop, a feature lost in Samoan and many other Polynesian languages, making it phonetically more conservative. Grammatical similarities. Both languages are a basic Austronesian structure, including verb, subject, object, word order, and extensive use of particles for tense and aspect, reflecting their common Proto-Polynesian heritage. Lexical similarities and differences. There are many shared vocabulary items due to their common origin, such as kava, or ava for kava, and fale for house. However, differences exist, such as puaka, Tongan, and pua'a, Samoan for pig. Similar. I mean, to me, that's just more of a pronunciation deal, but okay. Often involving sound shifts like the addition or omission of K in Tongan. These differences highlight their distinct evolutionary paths, with some studies suggesting Tongan and Samoan are as different as Spanish and Portuguese, yet with enough similarity for partial and mutual intelligibility. Okay, so they go through some of the words here. I'm going to skip through that. Broader Polynesian context. Within Polynesia, Tongic and Samoic are central to understanding the region's linguistic history. The Polynesian Triangle, defined by Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, encloses Polynesian proper, with Tonga and Samoa at its core. The Polynesian outliers spoken in Melanesia and Micronesia also show connections, with some traced back to Samoa, suggesting a complex network of interactions. This network likely facilitated further linguistic exchange, reinforcing the influence seen between Tongan and Samoan. Okay, conclusion. In summary, Tongic and Samoic languages are not older than each other, having diverged from the Proto-Polynesian around 2,500 years ago. I'm not necessarily buying the 2,500 years ago. Just like you do DNA studies, you know, there are 2 to 3 different schools of thought on how to interpret the aging of DNA material. But anyways, for this purpose, we're not going to get into that. Historical interactions, particularly Tongan dominance, led to language contact, with Tongan influencing Samoan through loanwords. Their development shows shared origin with distinct features such as Tongan's retention of the glottal stop, reflecting their unique paths within Polynesia. The analysis provides a comprehensive view of their relationship, highlighting both their unity and diversity. Anyways, I think this was, the main point I wanted to get out of this is a single point or single line analysis that somehow the grouping of more Samoic languages meant Samoan dominance. That is just one of the weakest ideas you can take. And this is what happens when you just take it looks like it's, grouped together. That means there's a Samoan dominance and the Tongan dominance didn't exist. Wrong, right? The only evidence for dominance is actually one way, Tongan on the Samoic. And then when you look at it, it is the Tongic languages were more conservative and maintained its conservative structure compared to the Samoic and the Eastern Polynesian, and that really the driver behind the separation of the languages is evolution and change in the language. And so one could easily look at colonization as the driver behind that radical change. And it could happen much quicker and in a smaller amount of time, hundreds of years, rather than the thousands of years that seems to be the general accepted position there. So, let's see. Lot of questions here, guys. If there's, I'm gonna, now that we're kind of gotten through the article itself, if there's any specific questions that want to be brought up, we can kind of re-enter it here at the bottom of the chat. There's just been a lot of activity. Great to see everyone talking and sharing ideas. But it's well, see, here's an interesting one. Toko, maybe exclude data from Wikipedia for prompt for Grok because it's mostly inaccurate history. I understand what you're saying, UTOL, but here's the problem. One could easily say that about oral history, right? One could easily say that about Kava sessions. One can easily say that about the stories that you heard since you were a little kid. We understand, you know, Wikipedia is a community driven, it can be influenced, it's not, but I also see that with quote unquote academic studies as well, where the academic study is driven more by personal interest of the academic, right? The drive to come up with a new idea as being more important than coming up with the truth. So we throw the ideas in. That's why, you know, I think Easy was saying, oh, you pick and choose. Well, because it's like when you hear a story, some parts of the story might be true, and then other parts of the story might be just for entertainment value purposes. And so if you throw the whole story out, that might be unwise, but accepting the entire story may be unwise too. So you have to use a little bit of wisdom and judgment. No one's ever going to perfectly manage 100% accuracy, but we can just navigate through that. Let's see here. Let me see here. Josh here seems to be pretty passionate today. You can't just say it's colonization. You're really disrespecting other cultures and language because you want to get a one up on someone. What else would be the explanation, Josh, in your thoughts? You know, how else would you explain the radical changes there? That would be my question. We don't have any other recorded history. We don't have documented within our own oral history. But what we do know is colonization resulted in radical change. And if the study says the divergence of the languages is not from different origins or that one's older than the other, it is more driven by diversification and changes in the language, what else can we come up with an idea on what would drive that? You know, I'm open to any ideas on that, Josh. If you're saying that, you know, we're just bringing up colonization as a one up, no, that's just like the most immediate response to that. If there's other ideas for it, would love to hear that. But that's kind of the initial kind of reaction to that concept. So that's that portion of the discussion here. Wanted to walk through. There's a lot of discussion going back and forth here on YouTube. So great discussion there. Looks like Water Bears, Josh, Easy, and the team here are having a great time discussing things and having a good conversation. So that's great. So I think for the second half of the show, we're coming up on the first hour. We're going to discuss a topic here that I think is really important to understand. And this is This is something. Let's see some questions here. I'm going to try and just buy in some time here. Before I move on to the other topic, it says Meleka says Tokelau language is under the Samoic outlier languages, but a lot of the languages in this group is not understood by Tokelau people, but not Samoan people. Not 100% sure on what you're trying to get there, Meleka. If you're saying that the Tokelau language is not as similar to Samoan as it's indicated, I'll come back to what was the discussion earlier, Meleka, is those groupings of languages is not always necessarily how similar they are, but the similar radical changes away from the Proto-Polynesian parent language that they seem to say that the Tongic language branch is a lot closer to the Proto-Polynesian origin language. So the way you could possibly interpret the groupings is not necessarily that they come from the same source as the Samoic, but they've gone through similar changes over time, and the morphing of the language is one way you could look at it. Let's see. All right. With that being said, this is something that I think is also an important conversation to have. I'm going to pull this up here, and we're going to listen to a podcast of kind of walking through the Talakai Faiki, quote unquote, liberation of Ha'amoa and how that conversation goes. Let me see here if I can find the video. Looks like there's another question here. Josh says, why would you group Samoic and East Polynesian changes together when East Polynesia is linked straight from the source? I don't know what you mean from the source. What's the source, Josh? I don't fully understand. Why would you group Samoic and East Polynesian changes together when East Polynesian is linked straight from the source? I don't know exactly what you mean by source. Oh, nuclear. Okay. Maybe that's something I'm not clear on. I'm not sure on how, when, from the data that I looked at, how it says that Eastern Polynesian is closer to nuclear Polynesian than Samoic. Just from that split on the nuclear, it seems to be a separation. Yeah, let's look at the chart. Okay, let's come back to the chart here. Nope. Where is it? Okay. Right here. So let's bring this back up. So there. Yeah. So in this chart, if you're saying, yeah, it's closer to here, to me, the way I understand what we walk through, Josh, is the Tongic is a lot closer to the Proto-Polynesian, maintaining that kind of like archaic form. This branch is a diversification and morphing of the language at a more rapid pace than the Tongic. This is why the glottal stop is lost, right? That the language on the nuclear Polynesian is more of a morphing and changing. That's what kind of the data we were looking at was saying, that there was a faster evolutionary. Let me come down to this table right here. So you have the Proto-Polynesian. The Tongic line stays more conservative, right? So really the split is this one stays more conservative. The nuclear Polynesian is more about rapid change in the language. So it is a diversification and rapid change. So as we come down here, there's two splits in that rapid change. Samoic outlier has its own outline of diversification and separation away from the Proto-Polynesian, and the Eastern Polynesian has its own, right? One could make the argument, the Samoic language could have had a slower change or radicalization or evolutionary because it was of closer proximity to Tonga, and that was as the Polynesian Empire shrinks, right? And Maui Tekelangi likes to use this metaphor is if you have a tree and the tree grows, the root is the origin or the cradle of the civilization. Then you have the body, and then you have the branches. As the tree dies, the further away you are from the root, the more rapid the decay. So you could look at it as Eastern Polynesia being further away from Samoa and Tonga would deteriorate much quicker. Then you would have what's closer to Samoa and Tonga have some deterioration, but not as quickly as the others. And then obviously the Tongan, from our perspective, would have been the root, has the least amount of decay and closest to the Proto-Polynesian language. So that's why I took that position there, Josh, and that's the explanation for it from my perspective. So this is an exercise in slowest decay, much quicker decay or morphing of the language, right? Much faster than the Tongic, and then between the Samoic and the Eastern Polynesia being even further away, had more radical changes in the same amount of time than the Samoic. We have another comment here. Logically, that chart would be somewhat accurate. I mean, easy. I mean, I don't know, man. Like maybe. I mean, I don't know. I'm assuming. What I'm trying to do is I don't necessarily agree with a lot of this. All I'm trying to do, easy, as we walk through this is use their own framework of thinking to say, if this is accurate, which I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I'm just, they call it steel manning, I guess. If I concede to you that you are correct in your analysis of the languages, like I said, I don't agree with the thousands of years of separation. I think it's shorter amount of time than that. But anyways, whatever. Neither here nor there. But I'm just assuming this is accurate. As you mentioned, as we've heard from other comments here from people from Tokelau and all these, they have their own thoughts. They say, hey, we actually think these languages sound a lot closer to Tongic or whatever. Could be not. I think Uvea and Futuna sound a lot more like Tongan than Ha'amoa, than Samoan. But that's just me. But they have this set up as Uvea and Futuna sounding more like Samoic, right? So, with that being said, looks like Meleka has returned. Sorry, I meant Tokelau understand Tuvalu, Puka Puka, Uvea, but Samoan language is different. They can't speak our. Yeah, I don't know. I don't disagree with that, Meleka. This is just this is what they came up with, right? I'm not saying it's 100% accurate. I'm just trying to enter into the way they view it and try to say, hey, if you are right, how could we interpret this data? Let's see here. It says here, why does central northern outlier islands who were never colonized have closer language to East Polynesians, and I can understand them? I'm not sure who are those northern outlier islands who were never colonized. As far as I understand, there is only one nation in the Pacific that was never colonized, and that's Tonga. So I'm not 100% sure on that question, Josh. Josh says, I agree with what you're saying, but saying colonization was the drive is false. I mean, what would be your thoughts on that? I'm open to that, Josh. I can't think of anything else. Tell me something else that you would say would drive such a radical change, in my opinion. When you piece it all together, Maui. Let's see if there's any other questions here that we'll go through before we go to the next portion. Here's another question. Renegade says, will we see Xiaoxi Ilayu back on the podcast? Yes. Xiaoxi said he is open for more conversations. It's just a matter of working out schedules, Renegade. I think what we'll do next is actually when we have the next opportunity to have Xiaoxi join, we'll just have him choose a topic of his preference and interest. I think he provided a lot of different ideas that we could dive into. And just have him share his perspective, the history, the oral history that he found. What I find very intriguing about Xiaoxi Ilayu is the fact that he has traveled to a lot of these islands and spoke with these people directly, right? I find that very intriguing. I find that very valuable. And the fact that he's visited so many of these islands and spoke to them face to face is critical. And then you add to that a lot of his history. Obviously, we have different perspectives than he has on certain ideas. You know, like one interesting thing, and we're, you know, the second portion of the show, we're going to walk through the oral history. There's a podcast that walks through the discussion of Talakai Faiki and Tuna and Fata and that whole situation. He has a unique perspective and idea there that actually I had kind of thought about a little bit, but never really fully developed. So I was shocked that Xiaoxi Ilayu shared that he had found oral history and evidence that the issue, and this may be a good transition in the next portion of the show. He says that the issue between Talakai Faiki and Tuna and Fata was a religious one. Okay, very interesting. He says that the issue at the time wasn't necessarily oppression. It was that Talakai Faiki wanted to put more emphasis on Hikuleo as a god rather than Tangaloa. And that was actually the driver of the tension between Tuna Fata and some of our Samoan brothers and sisters with Talakai Faiki, was that religious change that he wanted to institute into the Polynesian Empire. Easy says, can you talk about King Tupou changing the Tongan alphabet? Are you talking about Tupou the Fourth and how he restructured it? I don't have a lot of knowledge on that, Easy. Besides, I do know that they made changes to the alphabet to better represent the phonetics of the language, like taking out the R's. You know, when in the traditional Tongan Bible, even to this day, the spelling of it is from the early translations. They didn't change a lot of the words. And so there's more R's and so forth and J's, I think, in the old Tongan Bible, that Tupou the Fourth instituted a phonetic system that was much closer to how Tongans understood the sounds. Obviously, with the Bible being translated, a lot of that was influenced by Europeans. Once again, coming back to colonization, in that, you know, you change, the Europeans make the best efforts that they can to replicate the sounds that they hear and understand based off of how they write and understand things. And so there were a lot of letters that were used in the original translation of the Bible that didn't really match up with how Tongans made pronunciations. So he created a phonetic system for Tongan to better match, like the nga, the ng, right? The old Tongan Bible just had a G. He adds the ng because that's much closer to how the actual Tongans pronounce that word or letter phonetically. Let's see here. Yeah, 100% agreed there, UTOL. It is much more like a D. It's like a half D/T. You know, obviously in Ha'amoa, it's much more of a T. In Tonga, it's like a cross between a D and a T. Let's see. All right. I think that pretty much 100%. I don't disagree with that, Josh. Colonization also affected Tonga, just not physically. Well, in a sense, it did physically, but just not as much. right? Tonga had to adapt. If Tonga didn't learn how to adapt, Tonga would have been colonized, right? That's why certain parts of the culture was in a sense lost, but at the same time culture is always changing. What it meant to be Tongan 500 years ago was not the same thing as Tongan as 1,000 years ago. Culture is always changing. You're always making those evolutions in the culture and in the language. So you're always going to give something up, right? So yeah, let's see. Now, let me find this video here that I want us to walk through, and really this is some interesting discussions on it. Let me see if I can just open this up and find it. Hopefully I saved it, but I'm not seeing here. Oh, here it is. Perfect. We're going to pull this up. We're going to listen to a podcast here, short episode, 20 minutes. And it's really on the oral history on the Malietoa, quote unquote, war. Um, and I say quote unquote, if you guys can't tell already, I'm not a believer that this was a full blown war and that somehow there was a new nation born out of this. I'm much more of a believer that it was a scuffle. In the sense it was a battle, not necessarily a war, and that Talakai Faiki really wasn't expelled, but I understand that my position there is a minority. I thought this was a good transition, as some of the comments here this is another important way to understand oral history, and how oral history, you need to kind of just listen to it. It has a lot of good things in it, but you can't just take it all in. And oral history, one of the weaknesses of oral history is it takes a life of its own. And so you have to be very careful with that. And also, not all oral histories are created equal, just like not all scientific studies are created equal. This is not something that is just uniquely to oral history, but oral history does suffer from some of these challenges. But this is kind of an interesting concept. From what I can understand, this Inati creative, it looks like it's all driven. The voices here and the people are probably AI. It sounds like it's AI, but it's based off of data from, looking like using AI to search data online, something similar to what we did with the languages, but more in developing a podcast and a storyline. But we're going to listen through it, want to have some comments and discuss through it and react to the content itself. Once again, Inati Creative, this is a storyline that, we appreciate people who make content online. The more people that make content, the more it gives us opportunity to hear, learn, and then react more, right? This is the digital Kava sessions here, where ideas are brought in, we discuss it, we listen to it, you have an open mind. You don't have to believe everything, you don't have to accept everything, but the point is we're sitting here having a conversation, having ideas, and then we go from there and see where it goes. Let me unmute it. Let me know if you guys don't hear the sound. Sometimes I mute some of the background screens and forget to do so, but let's jump into it.
Hello to the deep dive. Ever wondered about those ancient ties that bind Pacific Island nations? Today, we're diving deep into a story that's just packed with powerful chiefs, epic sea voyages, and, well, a really dramatic showdown for freedom.
Yeah, it's quite the saga.
Get ready to explore the fascinating and, intertwined histories of Tonga and Samoa. It's a place where friendship and rivalry really played out on this grand Pacific stage.
Exactly.
We'll try to uncover the story of a mighty empire's reach and the legendary rebellion that ultimately reshaped the Samoan world.
And what's so fascinating here, I think, is just the sheer interconnectedness. These weren't isolated cultures, not at all.
Right.
It was this dynamic relationship spanning centuries. And these interactions between Tonga and Samoa, they offer such a powerful lens, a way to understand the complexities of power, influence, resistance,
Mhm.
all that in the region.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've really immersed ourselves in historical analyses, but also alongside those incredibly rich oral traditions passed down, through generations in both Tonga and Samoa.
Which are so vital here.
Totally. So, our mission today is to really try and understand this pivotal time, the era when the Tui Tonga Empire exerted its power in Samoa, the incredible story of the Samoan rebellion that rose up against it, and of course, the legendary origins of a title that holds just immense prestige in Samoa, even today, Malitoa.
A huge one.
Okay, let's unpack this foundational period.
Right. Let's maybe start with the architects. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Tui Tonga dynasty.
Oh
What
snap,
if, when
people!
uncertainty is high, heck,
This is what happens when the podcast is on a budget. We don't have the funds yet to pay for the free ads, guys.
CE with the founder Ahuitu.
Ahuitu.
Let's come back here. I missed a little bit.
Yeah.
The Tui Tonga dynasty. Their origins, they trace back to around 950 CE with the founder Ahuitu.
Ahuitu.
And what's really significant about him is his lineage. Tradition tells us he was the son of the sky god Tongaloa or Tagaloa in Samoa.
Oh, right. The same deity.
Yeah, an immortal Tongan woman. And the key takeaway here isn't just like a nice story. This divine connection.
I want to pause it there. Obviously, our position here on the podcast, anyone who's new, Tangaloa wasn't a god, right? There's conflicting oral histories across the board. Tangaloa wasn't a god. He was a man. That was the original, founding father line, right? The founding fathers of the Polynesian Empire, that being Maui, Tangaloa, and the Taula, right? Maui, the navigational scientific leader. Tangaloa is the kingly line that also has a priesthood with it. And then the Taula, which is the priestly line, right? So those are the three. And they say 950 AD. We believe that the Tui Tonga goes much further than that. And then once again, they say a Tongan woman. They say that because the Niwas are part of Tonga. But in all perspective, there was no Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, whatever. It was all, either part of the Polynesian Tui Tonga Empire or not. And Popua lived on the in the Niwas, and she came to Tongatapu because that's where Tangaloa resided. Okay, so just some context on where we stand there.
Bestowed this sacred authority on the Tui Tonga. It really elevated them, beyond just earthly rulers.
So right from the start, they weren't just powerful chiefs. They had this perceived direct link to the divine. That's a potent source of authority, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely potent.
Yeah.
And it seems they really leveraged this status to build this, far-reaching influence.
Okay.
The empire saw significant growth. It reached its zenith under the 10th Tui Tonga, Momo, and especially the 11th Tui de Tui. That's around the 11th, 12th century CE.
Right.
And their influence, it spread across this vast maritime area, a true thalassocracy, a sea-based empire.
Yeah.
We're talking modern-day Tonga, Samoa, though many who often stayed independent.
Yeah. Okay. Important distinction.
Yeah. New Fiji, lots of other islands scattered across the Pacific. It's huge. And this vast reach, it just underscores their maritime prowess, their ability to project power.
Across those distances.
Exactly. Facilitated by those remarkable double-hulled canoes, the Kalia.
And just want to pause there. That's the one thing that I can't remember one of the viewers that mentioned earlier that the Tui Tonga Empire was not always driven by military power, even though the Navy, obviously, of the Tongan Navy was the huge advantage. It was that religious component to the Tui Tonga that really provided stability. And that's a very important part to understanding the Polynesian Empire's stability and evolution over time, right? This is something that's really important to understand. When the first set of Westerners keen to Tonga or the Polynesian Empire, but especially to Tonga, where they started to interact with and see different leaders like the Tui Tonga, the Tui Kanukupolu, and the Tui Hatakalaua. The English, first contact with the English, they couldn't understand the political and the religious structure as to who had power, right? Captain Cook recognized that certain people would say, yeah, I'm the king, I'm the Tui Hapai, I'm the Tui Vava'u, I'm the blah, blah, blah. But then they also noticed that whenever the Tui Tonga showed up, the guys who said they were the kings and in charge were never around. So he understood there was an understanding that there was a complex nature of the political and the religious structure of the leadership in Tonga, right? And this is an important concept to understand on how the Tui Tonga, the Tui Hatakalaua, and the Tui Kanukupolu came into existence. Because military power was not the primary factor of the Tui Tonga's rule, he, meaning the Tui Tonga, could separate himself from the military, the administrative portions of the government, and still have influence and rule over the entire empire. Westerners don't have that full understanding, though, even though you could kind of make it a little bit that they saw, even through some of the popes and other, parts of Christianity where there was a merger between religion and government. Though we've kind of went away from that here in the Western civilizations. But this is the way to understand how the Tui Tonga and the Tui Hatakalaua and the Tui Kanukupolu relationships existed. The Tui Tonga in the beginning had religious, political, and military power, right? Then the Tui Tonga hands off the administrative, the political, and the administrative and military role to the Tui Hatakalaua, but maintain the religious sacredness to it, right? That's how the Tui Tonga was able to still be elevated above the Tui Hatakalaua. The Western perspectives are, the Tui Hatakalaua overtook the Tui Tonga and took control. Why would they say that? Because the Western civilization won't they say only, but heavily values military and political power over religious power. And that's how they understand governance, through military and political power. That wasn't always the case with our Polynesian ancestors, right? Then you go handful of generations with the Tui Hatakalaua. The Tui Hatakalaua says, I want to have a little bit more of that religious prestige, and I can't have that if I'm stuck doing the quote unquote administrative and political power. So that's where the Tui Kanukupolu comes into place. It was a passing on of the torch of responsibility of doing the work. And it wasn't, the Tui Hatakalaua usurped the Tui Tonga, or that the Tui Kanukupolu usurped the Tui Hatakalaua. It was a very unique and different perspective on how power was structured, right? Here, before we continue, looks like there's a few questions here. T Styles says, if you believe that Tangaloa being a man and not a god, but you believe in Hikuleo as a god of Israel. Yeah, I mean, people make fun of that, right? People make fun of that, but here's the main reasons for it, T Style. Tangaloa, from our perspective, we have a specific location where he resided. A lot of oral history behind that. And the Tui Tonga settlements, they had specific areas in each of their settlements that were named after where Tangaloa lived. Peretoa, right, was the location where Aho'eitu climbs up. It was actually a grove near Tapuhia or Langi. And so there is a lot of oral history and even pointing to a physical location where Tangaloa resided as a man. And that Tangaloa was basically the that was the ruler of the Polynesian Empire, was Tangaloa. Then, for whatever reason, something happened, right? And I can only look at history to potentially explain what could have happened, but something happened where Tangaloa said the eldest is not going to continue. The eldest would still inherit what their father had, meaning they would be recognized as absorbing as the eldest, but the heir and the power to rule would go to the Tuitonga. And something happened there. That's the whole story behind Aho Etu being eaten and died, having to be resurrected. Something happened there. Now, for Hikuleo, believe that Hikuleo is the God of Israel. The reason why, there's multiple reasons why I say that. People can make fun of it, whatever. George Vason, when he was, kind of gave up Christianity, living amongst the Tongans, he says that there were many, many practices of the ancient Tongans that he said have a odd familiarity, with some of the practices of ancient Israel. The knowledge of an afterlife, not just for the chiefs and so forth, but for all, that was something that was widely expected. And then looking at the name Hikuleo, the tail end of the voice, Jehovah many times would reside in a cloud and speak. And that's who led Israel in the 40 years. So there's other things behind it, but yes, that's my position on that. That's why I believe Polynesians embrace Christianity so heavily, is because it does ring so similar to what our ancestors believed. And so that's some of the thoughts behind that. UTOL says, was there a Tui Samoa or Tui Ha'amoa? Yes, more than likely, just like there was a Tui Futuna or Uvea. There was a Tui there. It rotated with families. The Tui Manua seems to be the best candidate for that UTOL of a title there, and it was rotated amongst, heirs from the 3 different islands in Manua. So I think that there was some kind of, if it wasn't that exact name UTOL, but it had either Tui Manua or someone of influence that would have had a similar title. Let's see. If we are talking about that, then Tahitians must have been the rulers, as Tapu Tapu Atea had the most religious power in Polynesia. Well, that's the interesting thing. That's why we got to have these conversations, Josh. I mean, someone's right and someone's wrong, or we got to understand that. We have a whole episode talking about Tapu Tapu Atea, and from our perspective, how do we make sense of that? In the podcast that we're watching, it mentions Momo and Tuitatui, right? It is around that time that Momo was the one who instituted where not everyone from every corner of the empire had to come to Tongatapu to bring twice a year, because twice a year, everyone in the empire had to come to Tongatapu, the Inasi, which is the more of the religious tithe to the Tuitonga because of his religious position. And the Inasi, the second tribute, the Inasi was more for the political / administrative role of the government. That was more like a tax. Once again, the Polo Polo is more like a tithe, a religious offering. The Inasi is much more of a administrative tax that everyone would bring to Tonga, to Tongatapu specifically. And so it is my perspective. How would I explain Tapu Tapu Atea? That could have been a designated location where Momo said, instead of everyone in Eastern Polynesia coming twice a year to Tongatapu, you will meet at Tapu Tapu Atea. I will have a designated representative of mine to receive your Polo Polo or your Inasi on behalf of the Tuitonga. Then I don't know if that individual would then make, that one single family or individual would then make the trip to Tongatapu on behalf of all the islands. But that we have an episode that kind of walks through that. That's something to consider. I mean, I don't know. That's the way I would approach that. Let's see. We kind of talk about this. Why does Tapu Tapuate have similar structures, the stone structures like the Tuitonga has in La Paja? Once again, Nonsky, that's why we said it could have been a designated location to receive the Inasi and the Polo Polo on behalf of the Tuitonga. Another comment here from Josh. He says, we cannot act like Tangaloa could only be used as a name for just, no, we do not believe that Tangaloa was one name, right? It's just like Maui. Maui was a title, not a individual person. That's why the name Maui sounds like it lives for forever, is that when person inherits that title, they take on the name, just like Tangaloa. Tangaloa was a title that name was inherited by the person who picks up the title. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Maria Water Bears to eat Tijuana on my dad's side. 100% best tacos in the land. Vaini Potogiai. So, all right. Looks like we caught up on the majority of those questions there. Let's head back to the podcast.
So I would call you. Right.
And they're, I mean, highly developed navigational skills,
Yeah.
really sophisticated stuff.
Wow. Imagine the skill, the daring it took navigating like that in those vessels. It really highlights the ambition, the ingenuity of these early Polynesian navigators.
It really does.
So here's where it gets really interesting for me. How did they actually manage to hold it all together, this widespread domain?
Yeah, good question. It seems like several interconnected elements were pretty crucial. First, there was the Inasi,
The Asi.
a sophisticated tribute system. Basically, subject islands had to send annual gifts, often
There
their
we
best
go.
resources, crafted goods, to the Tuitonga back on Tagatapu.
Okay.
And the key insight here, I think, is that this wasn't just about stuff, about material goods. It was a powerful mechanism for constantly reinforcing Tonga's dominance and the Tuitonga's sacred status, you know, in the eyes of everyone else.
Right. A constant reminder of who's in charge.
Exactly.
Okay.
And secondly, you had these flourishing trade networks crisscrossing the.
I want to pause that real quick because I think here's an interesting thing that would be, I think, a good piece of knowledge that we got from Maui Tekalangi. So the Polo Polo, they mentioned here the Inasi, the Polo Polo was always managed by the Tuitonga. Even when the Tuitonga resided in Ha'amoa, in Samoa for multiple generations, the Tuitonga would always come to Tongatapu for the Polo Polo. The Inasi, as we mentioned, is much more of a administrative or tax kind of situation, that when the Tuitonga handed off the administrative and the political power to the Tuihatakalaua and eventually the Tuikanukupolu, those two lines managed the Inasi. Okay, because it was much more a political or a tax situation. Now, it is not correct, or at least from Maui Tekelangi's perspective, to assume that when this tax was brought to Tongatapu, that it all stayed in Tongatapu, right? The way it functioned is this. All the different islands would bring those products. Those products would be brought to the Tui Hatakalaua, the Tui Kanukupolu. Some of that product would be absorbed by the Tui Hatakalaua, the Tui Kanukupolu. However, other products were then organized and exchanged. The Tui Kanukupolu and the Tui Hatakalaua were responsible for, okay, Ha'amoa, we all know Samoa had the best axes, stone axes and so forth. They would bring that. They would bring mats. Uvea and Futuna would have something that they were really good at. They brought that to the table, right? Whatever was brought from, let's say, Tapu Tapuatea from East Polynesia was brought to the table. Stuff from Fiji all over. Some of that was absorbed by the Tuihatakalaua, Tuikanukupolu. Then they also had the responsibility of, hey, take some of the stones and divide the stone axes and divide it amongst everybody that was there. You know, whatever Uvea brought was divided, and there was a distribution of all these goods amongst all the different families. And when I say families, the Polynesian Empire was a giant network of family, right? Because the practice of the Tuitonga and also of Tangaloa was intermarrying throughout all the islands to establish the leading families and governing families on all the islands that had blood ties back to Tongatapu. That's what held it together. That's what allowed the stability in the Polynesian Empire for thousands of years. And that is how that relationship was managed. Now, want to come back to the thought of the Inasi was, yes, political tribute, a tax, but it also was a redistribution of all these highly cherished products throughout the empire that was brought and distributed amongst all the families in the empire. That was the massive network of trade that happened once a year. And that's where a lot of the majority of that trade happened from our perspective. It's not that they were little stores throughout all of these different islands. It was more of everybody came to Tongatapu for the Inasi, delivered their best products from where they came in return, because it's a very long, painful, and dangerous journey to make it to travel to Tonga for the Inasi. And to help maintain the prestige and the relationship, you give something back in return so that those families would take back to their respective islands of evidence of, look at what other parts of the empire produce that is of great value. And that would be a cherished item within the families throughout Polynesia. All right, let's come back.
The empire, exchanging prized things like Samoan bustle vases,
Oh yeah, those are famous.
fine mats, distinctive pottery. And beyond just the economics, this exchange created this sort of web of interdependence. And it acted as a conduit, spreading ideas, innovations across the region.
Like cultural diffusion too.
Precisely. And thirdly, strategic elite intermarriage.
Mhm.
That played a vital role.
Yeah.
Particularly this practice called tokatufa.
Dakatufa.
Yeah. High-ranking women from influential families on other islands were brought to Tonga to marry into the royal lineage.
Okay.
And then their kids could potentially go back and rule their home islands. So it solidified alliances, extended Tongan influence through these kinship ties.
Wow.
So you see how these things work together, right?
Yeah.
The Inasi provided resources, reinforced.
This is something that's really important about the work that's happening right now in the conversations. The only person, I even had to go to Grok to search online, who else out online is speaking about Tokatufa. There's only one source that Grok came back with, and that is Tevita Fale. Tevita Fale is the only one that has published articles discussing this ancient practice. That's why I'm pretty sure, this is all driven by AI on this podcast. This is why it's important that we're having this content being put out, right? To me, it's already having impact. This concept of Tokatufa is a concept that only Tevita Fale and the Polynesian Eyes podcast has published online, and it's already having impact. This is why we're having these conversations. This is why creating content and putting it out there and really establishing those ideas is really important. If you have a desire to put content out there, 100% encourage it. Put these ideas out there, let people have access to it, and then let people decide what they want to believe. But to me, when I would listen to this for the first time, I was like, this is evidence of why it's important to put out the content that we need to do, because it leads to more people understanding it. And now that we have access to AI, and as AI continues to grow, the more important it is to put that content out there. So it was kind of cool to see this this channel bring out that concept of Tokatufa, because that's something that really, from everything we can see, originates from the Polynesian Eyes podcast and Tevita Fale's work.
Authority.
Yeah.
Trade fostered interdependence.
Yeah.
Strategic marriages built alliances. It was this like multifaceted approach to keeping the empire going.
That's a really sophisticated system, using economic, political, even family ties to maintain control. But as you mentioned, and our sources remind us, the Tui Tonga weren't the first major power in this part of the Pacific, were they?
No, absolutely not. That's a crucial point. Before the Tui Tonga really rose to prominence, there was a significant Samoan-based maritime power centered in the Menua Island group.
Manu again.
Yeah, led by the Tui Manoa. Some oral traditions even suggest a time when the Tui Manua held sway over Tonga itself.
Really? Over Tonga.
Yeah, and that Tonga had to kind of actively assert its independence before starting its own expansion. So it's fascinating to think the Tui Tonga.
That just, hey, that's one idea out there, right? You know, we've tackled this over and over. We've done chokeholds. We've, put triangles, guillotines. We even had some knockouts with oofy pits and, archaeological evidence that the Tui Manua is only 500 years old. But hey, it is what it is. It is what it is.
Tonga's arrival in Samoa was more like a shift in a long-standing regional power dynamic, not the start of it all.
Right. They weren't stepping into a vacuum.
Exactly. They weren't stepping into a void.
That provides really crucial context for what happens next. Okay, so
We're Phoenix Energy, a family-owned oil company focused on
Really understand. I don't, like I said, we don't agree with the Tui Manua as a empire. We believe the Tui Manua existed, but not necessarily as an empire that governed.
Tongan influence in Samoa, particularly Upolu and Savaii, it becomes quite established. How long are we talking here? Roughly.
Well, the oral traditions generally point to a period of maybe 3 to 4 centuries.
Wow, that long.
Yeah, 300 or 400 years of direct Tongan rule or, significant hegemony in those parts of Samoa. That's a substantial chunk of time. It would have definitely impacted the social, political, cultural landscape.
For sure.
And this likely involved, Tongan governors overseeing things, the regular collection of tribute going back to Tonga.
The Inasi again.
And
Yeah.
implementing Tongan administrative systems. The settlement of Safotu on Savaii. That's often mentioned in oral accounts as maybe being a Tongan center during this time.
Safotu.
Yeah.
Okay. And the figure who really stands out in the Samoan accounts of this period, the one associated with the eventual pushback, that's Tui Tonga Talakaifeki.
Yes, Talakafeki. He's a truly pivotal figure in this whole narrative, especially from the Samoan perspective.
Right.
Historical analysis suggests he might have been the 15th Tui Tonga or maybe a ruler around then whose name appears in Tongan king lists as Olomipupu.
Lomi-Tupu. Okay.
Now, Tongan historical accounts, they do acknowledge a period of unrest, a Samoan revolt during his reign.
Mhm.
But the Samoan oral traditions, they paint a much more critical, much more vivid picture.
How so?
Well, in these narratives, Talakaifaiki is depicted as
Well, and that's what I think is kind of interesting, right? The Tongan oral history recognizes that an event happened during Talakaifaiki's time, right? But also in Ha'amoa, it's a much more intricate thing and much more pivotal. And all granted, it was a big event in Ha'amoa's history, but I think that's kind of indicative too. So we'll see how it goes.
frankly, a cruel and tyrannical ruler. The stories detail accusations of enslaving Samoans, forcing them into really hard labor, like building forts and roads,
Wow.
and just generally ruling with excessive harshness, brutality.
That's a very strong indictment. It sounds like the Samoan oral tradition really hammers home the oppressive nature of his rule. What's the significance of that emphasis, do you think?
Well, if you connect it to the bigger picture, right? Samoan identity, the legitimacy of their later autonomy, this powerful emphasis on Talakaifaiki's alleged tyranny, it serves a crucial purpose.
Which is?
It legitimizes the Samoan uprising that follows.
Exactly.
By painting the Tongan ruler as this unbearable oppressor, the narrative tones the rebellion from just a power struggle into a necessary, morally justified act of liberation.
Okay, I see.
It gives a clear reason for the Samoan actions. It boosts the heroic status of the resistance leaders, and ultimately, it reinforces the legitimacy of the Maliotoa title that comes out of this very conflict.
Right.
So the way Talakaifaiki is remembered directly supports that whole foundational story of Samoan independence.
That makes perfect sense. You kind of need that narrative of oppression to justify such a massive act of defiance and setting up a whole new order.
So who are the key players then? Who spearheaded this Samoan rebellion?
The main figures in the Samoan resistance were these brothers, Tuna and Fata, often described as sons or descendants of a respected chief named Atioki.
Tuna and Fata.
Okay. We also hear about their elder brother, Savea, and a particularly, remarkable nephew, Ulamasui.
Illuminati got it.
And notably, Tuna and Fada, they already had this.
I never heard really much about Ulumasui until this podcast, and so or this, listening to this episode, kind of looked into it. They talk about him a lot more. Usually, I just hear about Tuna and Fata, and then Savea, who actually becomes a Marietoa. So yeah, I mean, this AI podcast was still pretty instructive.
This reputation for bravery, for strength, which ironically seems to be what made Talakai Faiki suspicious, maybe even fearful of their growing influence. So the very things that probably earned them respect among Samoans made them a threat to the Tongan ruler. What finally kicked things off? What was the catalyst?
Well, sensing Talakai Faiki's unease, maybe potential plans against them, Tuna and Fata are said to have basically fled.
Yeah.
They sought refuge in Alipata on the eastern side of Upolu.
Alipata, okay.
And from there, this strategic spot, they sent out messengers across Samoa, rallying different chiefdoms, communities, trying to unite them for a common cause, kick out the Tongans.
See, this is where, kind of like the AI individuals here, see a couple people because, hey, this sounds like AI. It's 100% AI. But what I find interesting is there's a lot of politics that goes into oral history, right? Of course, the Marietoas are going to make it sound like Talakai Faiki was oppressive, and he may have been. Xiaoxi Ilayu says there's oral history that he's found, and just some evidence he's found that this was not necessarily oppression as it's seen, but more of Talakai Faiki wanted to switch the focus from Tangaloa to Hikuleo, and that there was opposition in Ha'amoa to that. And so that's what makes it interesting. But I want to bring up here is they make it sound like Tuna and Fata were like going around and they united the entire island. Well, once again, I think that's embellishment. And I'll give my reasons for it later, but I think that's more of entertainment value and boosting for politics than maybe actual history.
Reclaim their autonomy.
Right.
And the rebellion, according to the main accounts, it hits its climax with this meticulously planned surprise attack.
An ambush.
Exactly. An ambush planned during a big feast.
And I want to reiterate this. There is no strong history or even oral history of a war, right? Like they mention here, it's like, oh, the climax of the rebellion. You got to remember, the climax is just so far, there's not like a bunch of battles, like we look at Taufa Ahau, we hear a bunch of those battles and it's recorded, and you don't just overthrow or unite an entire archipelago of islands just from one battle, right? There's actually takes years, and it takes a lot of alliances, relationship buildings, even marriages to unite a handful of islands. So this idea that Tuna and Fata just overnight united everyone, and then there's just this one singular battle that wins the war, dude, that never happens. That never happens. So you already, for me personally, excuse me, it already gets suspicious when they're like, oh yeah, it was this great battle of liberation, but all we hear is one battle. We don't have extensive discussions. I mean, even from before actual contact and recorded history with the missionaries, even in Tonga, there are legendary battles that happen that are documented in different places. And it's always multiple battles, not just one. That just one battle that won a war. That's unheard of in my opinion. But once again, for the Marietoa side, of course they would want to make it sound like they won a war, because it elevates their title and their position and their prestige. Of course you would want to have that story told.
In Alipata. Some traditions even say it was for Talakai Faiki's birthday.
No way.
Yeah. And crucially, weapons clubs, other traditional weapons, were hidden beforehand. Some accounts have this great image of them buried under the sand where the feast was happening.
Wow.
And the signal, the agreed upon signal for the attack, it was the start of the Tongan Matamatame dance.
Using their own cultural performance against them, that's incredibly dramatic. Okay, so what happened when the signal was given?
We had one.
one thing I find interesting here, and I think important to note, is it is out of this event. It is out of this event that certain practices that happen to this day in Tonga is practiced to this day. So really, some of the stories are they hid a lot of their weapons under the pigs because the pigs used to face down when you would present them to the Tuitonga, right? And they hid them under there or inside the pigs. This is why, and I didn't know this until, even when I was in Tonga, I always wondered why, why do they go? They slap the pig, they lift it up, they count it, and they're visually inspected one by one. It is because of this, right? This is the reason why, because of this event, the Tuitonga changes, or the Farefa, they change the whole ritual of presentation of tribute. Because of that, they're counted, the pigs are inspected, they're lifted up, make sure there's nothing under. So that's how we know that this battle with Tuna and Fata actually happened, right? So, and that's the impact to this day that this story has on even how Tonga behaves in their traditional functions because of this.
Well, upon that signal, hundreds of Samoan warriors led by Tuna and Fata, they just rose up, launched this swift, coordinated attack on the, unsuspecting Tongans.
Chaos, I imagine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Some versions even add this detail of the Samoan dancers who were unarmed, kicking away the sand to reveal the hidden weapons.
Nice touch.
The attack was fierce, very effective. Significant Tongan casualties. Some accounts estimate maybe 200 Tongan warriors fell just in that initial assault. Yeah. Talkai Faiki himself, along with the remaining Tongans, they fled westward towards the coast at Mulafano, trying to get to their canoes, their fleet.
Trying to escape.
But the Samoan leaders were relentless. They pursued them. Fata and Ulumasui led one group chasing along the south coast of Upolu, while Tuna and another chief, Tapuola, they chased along the northern route.
So a coordinated pursuit, too. And it's during this chase that Ulamasui, the nephew, really comes into his own right. We hear these almost supernatural stories about him.
Indeed. Ulamasui is this really captivating figure, often associated with extraordinary abilities, a manifestation of what Polynesian cultures call mana.
Mana. Spiritual power.
Exactly. Spiritual power, divine favor. One really well-known story is about an incident where Talakai Faiki, maybe as a last act of intimidation, he tasks Tuna with moving this enormous boulder. Impossible feat, right? Threatens him with death if he fails.
Yikes.
So Tuna can't move it. He turns to Ulamasui for help. And Ulamasui, after some, incantation, spiritual preparation, he supposedly summons legions of sea creatures, eels, octopuses, other marine life, who miraculously work together to push this massive boulder into the sea.
That's incredible.
And there are even accounts where Tuna and Fata, after the victory, they start quarreling, tragically kill each other.
No.
Only to be miraculously brought back to life by Ulamasui's powerful mana.
Wow. So these aren't just cool stories. They obviously carry a much deeper cultural, historical weight.
Precisely.
One thing that I thought interesting about these stories, and this is in relation to Siausi Ilayu's perspective, that this conflict was religious based, right? That there was a conflict of who should be held as the highest regard as God. Should it be Tangaloa or should it be Hikuleo? And it almost sounds like kind of similar to Tupo the First and some of the challenges that he put out to the Christian God. Well, if your God is the true God, that, they would, the taupatahi, the shark wouldn't eat you, or that your God would stop the tide from coming forth and, sticking a stick into the ground, into the sand, on the beach. And this is kind of interesting. Just listening to the stories here of Tuna Fata and their nephew Ulumasui, I think is his name. These seems to be challenges by Talakai Faiki of, well, if your God is the real God, then move this rock, or, they kill each other and they get resurrected. I don't know if it has a lot of grounds to it, but it seems interesting.
These extraordinary feats tied to figures like Ulamasui, They elevate the Samoan struggle within the whole narrative. They really underscore that deep connection between the spiritual and the political in Polynesian cosmology.
Yeah,
Right.
100%.
Attributing
That's
mana
true.
like that suggests divine blessing for the Samoan cause. It implies the very forces of nature, the land, the sea, were on their
There we
side
go.
against foreign oppression.
Yeah.
It gives their victory this sense of like sacred legitimacy and reinforces the heroic status of the leaders.
So, okay, the Tongans are routed. They're fleeing to their ships at Molefanua. And this sets up that iconic moment, the encounter that leads to the Malietoa title. What happened right there?
So, as Kalakaifaiki and what's left of his forces reach their canoes near Mulifanua, they're confronted by the pursuing Samoans, Tuna, and Fata. He realizes he's about to escape, but he's facing these really determined warriors.
Hmm.
So Talakaifaiki, standing on this prominent rock, which later became known as
Tulutule.
he addresses his pursuers. And it's at this critical moment that he utters that now famous speech.
The speech that birthed one of Samoa's highest titles. Can you share that key phrase again?
Absolutely. In Samoan, he declared, Malito, Malito, utleto sao ile oli ditao, ai ole eusao ile ili li follow.
And the English translation.
Brave warriors, bravely fought. I shall return no more in the black clouds of war, but I shall return in the black clouds of sail.
Malietoa, brave warriors. And from those words, the
I think this is an important thing to have a conversation on real quick, right? Number one, like I said, I have a lot of doubts as to whether this was an actual war and just a singular battle. But let's walk through what was said here, right? They just mentioned it in the podcast, but it says, according to Samoan oral history and historical accounts, Tuitonga Talakaifaiki, as he was fleeing Samoa after being defeated by the brothers Tuna and Fata, it is said to have delivered a famous speech from a rock later called Tulatala. The words attributed to him are Marietoa Marietau Afai o Maitonga e sau ile auliuli folau aele sau ole auliuli tau. All right, that's my Samoan interpretation there. And it says, brave warriors, bravely have you fought. If the Tongans ever come back, it will be for a friendly visit, not to wage war. Okay. Number one, there's not a lot of even the oral history of multiple battles, right? But the question is, does this sound like someone who was defeated in a war where they're saying, hey, if the Tongans ever come back, it would be for a friendly visit, not for war. It doesn't sound like he's being threatened, like he can't come back. It's not like, hey, guys, do I need to get your permission to come back to Ha'amoa? It sounds like he's just saying, guys, when I come back, we're not going to be for war. I saw a video, and I think King Afa makes a reasonable position on this, a concept that it was intended not to kill Talakaifaiki. Because I think, I agree with King Afa's analysis on here, is that would have been a fatal flaw by Tuna and Fata, right? If Talakaifaiki gets killed, we're not just talking about the Tongans. We're talking about the Polynesian Empire is going to come and wipe them out. And I will even say this. They probably don't even need everyone from outside of Ha'amoa. I would say even the loyalists within Ha'amoa themselves probably would have crushed Tuna and Fata. And I'll explain to you why I say that. Because Marietoa didn't even unite all of Samoa. Right? So that tells me it wasn't like they united the all of Samoa and they had this, established leadership. It sounds like they had a significant enough rallying of people to oppose Talakaifaiki. Talakaifaiki wasn't there for war. It sounds like some kind of celebratory thing. Some say it's his birthday, whatever. I don't know. But they weren't there intended for war. Right? And he doesn't get killed. And then he says, when I come back, it's going to be for a good time. I'm not going to come back and fight you guys. And actually, you know what? Good job. Maybe he felt impressed that they stood up for themselves. I don't know. But I find that very interesting. And, even after that, multiple generations later, Kaulfo Nuafekai, he comes to Ha'amoa after he creates the Tu'i Hatakalaua in Tonga to run the administrative portion of the Polynesian Empire. He goes to Ha'amoa, and oral history says that the Tu'i Tonga resides in Ha'amoa for 4 or 5 generations, whatever it is, before Tapu Osi returns back to Tonga Tapu. But I think that's kind of interesting. Number one, it doesn't sound like it was an actual war, more like a battle, and it doesn't seem to me that Talakai Faiki is saying, "Yeah, you've kicked me out." No, he's just saying, "Hey, I'll be back, but when I come back, it won't be the war. Don't worry, I won't come back and wipe you out. I respect you for what you did." In essence, let's see here. Let's see. Interesting. Let's see. Comment here from Easy. Why are we watching a video created by a Palangi? We can tell our own stories. Well, it's called Inati Creative. I'm assuming this is probably produced by some Polynesians. They're just using AI to talk it out. So it's probably run by some Polynesians, to be honest, Easy. But definitely AI and Palangi voices they chose to tell the story. Let's see here. Let's come back.
The esteemed Samoan chiefly title Malietoa originated, which, as you said, is now one of the 4 Tamaiga, the highest titles in Samoa.
That's right.
But our sources mentioned there are some variations in the traditions about who actually got the title first.
Yeah, that's pretty common with oral histories, right? Different perspectives, interpretations develop over time.
100%.
One prominent version says Tuna and Fata immediately started arguing over who deserved it.
Oh, dear. After all that.
Yeah, even getting violent, striking each other down.
Why are you not investing in tax
Oh,
rates?
snap.
No, seriously.
We're gonna
Why are you not investing?
pause the noise here. Then that's, this is the important thing about oral history is, it has different perspectives. Some of it is accurate, some of it is not. Not all oral history is designed to be 100% accurate. It's more of maybe to be more memorable and maintain some of the core concepts, but not necessarily to be an exhaustive effort of recording every minute detail.
It was then that Ula Masui supposedly stepped in, revived the brothers.
Using his mana again.
Presumably, and suggested they give the title to their elder brother Savea to basically stop the conflict and keep unity.
Ah, a diplomatic solution.
Exactly. So consequently, Malietoa Savea is generally recognized as the first holder of this really significant title. But yeah, other accounts offer variations. Some say Savea just naturally took leadership and was recognized. Others say Tuna and Fata were meant to get it but deferred. Or maybe they gave it to Ulu Masui out of gratitude.
It's fascinating how all these different threads exist.
Another interesting thread of the oral history is that Tuna and Fata were not even born and raised in Ha'amoa, that they could have been from like Tokelau or maybe Tokelau or another island. There's some of the oral history there that I've heard. I don't know if that's from outside of Ha'amoa, but there has been some oral history that Tuna and Fata were from other islands and happened to relocate to Ha'amoa and led that whole rebellion. So that's another interesting aspect of the oral history as well.
But they all point back to this pivotal moment in the origin of the Malietoa title. It really underscores just how profoundly significant this event was in shaping Samoan history, their collective identity.
Totally.
And these titles are still incredibly influential today, which just shows the lasting impact of that historical turning point.
Precisely. The Malietoa title itself, it works like a powerful mnemonic device, a living embodiment of this historical moment. It's a constant reminder of the liberation, the ancestors' bravery, the conflict itself, and also that promise of future peaceful interaction in Talake Faiki's words. By embedding this whole foundational story within such a high, respected title, the memory is actively kept alive, passed down through generations. It deeply shapes Samoan identity and historical consciousness.
Okay, so the rebellion works, direct Tongan rule ends, the Malietoa title is
Once
born.
again,
Yep.
I'm I'm definitely not a believer of the direct Tongan rule or independence. It's more like the Tui Tonga recognize Marieto, gives him, hey, maintain influence or authority over that portion of Ha'amoa, but not really like an independent nation. And really, if the Tui Tonga really wanted to, solidify his rule and wanted, this is one of the reasons why I don't think it was an oppressive matter, because if Talakai Faiki was an oppressive kind of iron fist kind of leader, he would not tolerate this type of rebellion and then say, oh yeah, we'll let you live. If he was really iron fisted and cruel, trust me, he would have been back with an army to wipe people out. In my perspective.
What were the consequences then, immediate and longer term?
Well, the most immediate, biggest consequence around 1250 AD was just that.
Yeah.
The end of direct Tongan political control over Upolu and Savaii.
Right.
This starts a new era of Samoan autonomy, and it marks the rise of the Malitoa lineage as this dominant political force within Samoa. But, and this is crucial, the relationship didn't just stop. Interactions continued in different ways. For instance, some later Tui Tonga are actually recorded as having lived in Samoa for long periods. And that practice of elite intermarriage.
The Tokatufa.
Well, maybe not exactly that, but intermarriage between Tongan and Samoan chiefly families persisted. In some ways, it even intensified in the centuries after. We even have Malitoa Savea himself marrying a daughter of a Tui Tonga. So those connections endured.
Interesting. So even after this major conflict asserting Samoan independence, the ties weren't completely cut. And the sources also hint this Samoan victory might have even caused ripples back in Tonga politically.
That's a really insightful point. Yet in the centuries after the Samoan rebellion, Tonga went through some significant internal political changes. Around 1470 CE, Tui Tonga Kalafanoa established the Tu'uhara Kalawa dynasty.
Okay.
Strategically delegating secular power, administrative duties to this new line, while the Tui Tonga themselves took on a more sacred spiritual role.
Dividing the...
Kind of. And then later around...
I wanna pause that real quick and pull something up, see if I can pull it out here. And I just want to show, that idea that somehow that drove change and significant issues back in Tonga. I want to see if I can find Devita Fale's Tui Tonga line here. Let's pull it up. And we'll take a look here and see if we can find this. Let's stop the screen share here. We'll just look at this Tui Tonga line here from Devita Fale. Share screen, window, and there we go. Let's pull this up real quick. All right, so right there. Let's see, which Talakai Faiki was it? And that's the other thing too. Multiple Tui Tongas have the same name, and we'll just revisit this. Some of our usuals already understand this, but here's the Catholic list, Shirley Baker list, and Devita Fale's list of the Tui Tongas. Catholic list has 39 Tui Tongas. Shirley Baker's list has 48 Tui Tonga, and Devita Fale's list has 54. Now, a big challenge that was done here by Devita Fale is he actually ties a lot of these names to the six or seven settlements of the Tui Tonga throughout Tongatapu. And so these names are tied to ruins throughout Tongatapu, and also a lot of the oral history where a lot of these names are repeated, right? Like you see here, Lomi Aitupua the first, you had Pui Pui Kifatu, and some of these guys, as typical, a lot of these Tui Tongas were named after ancestors. So I'm trying to see on which, so there's Kaulfo Nuafekai. There's, okay, so sorry. So this Talakai Faiki, it's Talakai Faiki the third, who also has the Lomi Artupua name. And the reason why I know that this is the right Talakai Faiki, and this is where kind of the dates kind of go weird, right? Because there's other Talakai Faikis and they could say it's much later or much earlier. But the reason why I know this is the right Talakai Faiki is because this Tuitongas called Ma'akatoa, this name was in remembrance of when Talakai Faiki switches a lot of the processes of presenting tribute to the Tuitonga, right? Where they're lifting the pigs, they're counting it, they're inspecting it. That's where Ma'akato, that name comes from, because they actually solidified everything is done correctly to limit future surprise attacks on the Tuitonga, because the whole structure and the process had been created. So here we have Talakai Faiki here, the 33rd Tuitonga, who establishes the name and the title of Marietoa. Then we come down to Kaulufonua Fekai, who is actually the third Kaulufonua. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 6 Tuitongas later. Right? Now, granted, there was a lot of, I think, before Kaulufonua Fekai, his father Takalawa, 2 or 3 Tuitongas before that were assassinated. So there was some chaos that was going on, and a lot of it was driven. Like, here's an interesting story that Xiaoxi Ilayu shared, is this Tuitonga right here, this Tapuosi or Havea the second, was actually, the mother was from Uvea, and when they got crowned, or he, Tapuosi the third, got crowned as the Tuitonga, he was assassinated. And a lot of the people from Uvea and Futuna blamed Takalaua and said that he was behind the assassination. And because of that, it was people from Uvea who actually assassinated Takalaua. And that's who Kaulufonua Fekai chases throughout the empire, and chases them down to Uvea. And that's where they capture the assassins, and then Kaulufonua Fekai brings them back to Tonga, in many ways brutally and slowly kills them. And then he establishes the Tu'iha Takalaua, and then Kaulufonua Fekai moves the residents of the Tuitonga to Ha'amoa. So just kind of some of the backstory of when that's all happening. So from Talakai Faiki to Kaulufonua Fekai, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Tuitongas between that time. All right. Looks like there may be a question that popped up here. Oh, a couple comments here. Rebellion, or more like, did a great act of full of mana. I'll let you slide, because that's kind of one way to kind of explain it from my perspective, T-Style, because if it was really viewed as this threat to the power of the Tuitonga, and it was, a threat to his life, that would have been squashed, in my opinion. But it's more like he was impressed, and it may be tied to some of that oral history that was shared earlier. Not only an act of God and bravery in that battle, but it sounds like, if some of the other Samoan oral history is true, that there were other feats before then that Talakai Faiki kind of put out there to say, hey, if you really are who you think you are, move this big boulder, or, stop the seas from doing things. So it sounds to be a broader recognition of things there. Question, would you say, Tua, that how the video is presenting, that it made great changes to Tongan culture? Was that in rituals, or just some of the customs as security measurements? Well, that's where it kind of gets interesting. It seems to be recorded in the rituals of the security measures. Obviously, that has a huge impact, because that's now every time the Tuitonga has tribute and everything presented to him, that there is a direct impact on that. Now, where it gets interesting is if it was a religious question involved, like Xiaoxi Ilayu brings up, that this was a big part of this whole situation was because of religion, depending on how that whole religious question was impacted or impacted head on Talakai Faiki, maybe that's what led to other changes outside of that, which is interesting. That's just kind of some ideas and drawing conclusions from some of the oral history and the information that Xiaoxi Ilayu made. And maybe, and this is an interesting thing to consider, maybe this switch in the religious perspective led to the assassination of the Tuitonga, because it's like 3 Tuitongas shortly after Talakai Faiki get assassinated, like back to back to back. So something had changed significantly that led to that instability, which kind of gives more credence to Xiaoxi Ilayu's perspective that this was not really a rebellion for freedom by the Marietoa clan, but it was more of resistance to religious change that Talakai Faiki was looking to impose. I don't know if that answers your question, T Style, but that's some of the ideas or thoughts that come to mind associated with that concept. Let's share the screen, come back here. Let's come back here real quick.
On 1600 CE, the Tui Kanakapulu dynasty emerged. They eventually became the dominant political power in Tonga, and they're the direct ancestors of the modern Tongan monarchy.
And both of these
Mhm.
later Tongan dynasties, they kept strong family links back to Samoa, didn't they?
Absolutely. The name itself, Tui Kanakapulu, it literally translates to something like king of the flesh or heart or body of Upolu, directly referencing the Samoan island.
Wow, that's explicit.
It is. The founder of this really influential line, Ngata, was the son of a Tui Hatakalawa ruler and a high-ranking Samoan woman.
Right.
So this strongly suggests that maybe losing direct political control over Samoa prompted this kind of strategic rethink within Tonga.
Thinking about going solar.
See, and this is where some of these ideas kind of grow out. That is accurate oral history, right? That the Tuikanukupolu rises out of a marriage of the Tuihatakalaua to a Samoan woman that leads to Ngata and that whole situation there. But I know that it's kind of funny. A lot of our Samoan brothers and sisters, they take that as, well, see, just kind of like the language analysis, right? See, like you guys had to intermarry into the Samoan side because they believe that Tangaloa was from Ha'amoa, and that's had to marry into the bloodlines in Ha'amoa to elevate us. And they make comments like, "Oh, Tongans are a bunch of commoners," and that's why they had to intermarry into the Ha'amoa because the Tangaloa. And I'm just like, guys, if you understood that the Tu'i Kanukupolu was the lowest of the kingly lines, that you wouldn't say those things because it undercuts and really it diminishes the influence of the Ha'amoa people, because like we mentioned earlier, there was the Tu'itonga who had religious, political, and administrative power over the government. The lowest of those two responsibilities is the government and the administrative tasks of that government. The higher is the religious component. So the Tuitonga creates the Tuihatakalaua to do the lower tasks of the management of the government, right? Then the Tuihatakalaua then creates the Tu'ikanukupolu to do that task that's even lower, right? And further away from the Tuitonga. So really, it's this is why when they say, oh, commoners, brothers and sisters, if we use that logic, then the marrying into the Tu'ikanukupolu and making them basically the arms and legs to do that work, that doesn't work well for the Ha'amoa position of that. So I think that's something that's kind of forgotten in the mix there. Another interesting thing that I had learned here from Maui Tegelangi was the Tu'ikanukupolu. By the time Tu'itonga, by the time Tupo the first gets there, it's an elections kind of system. And I had always assumed that that was always the case for the Tu'ikanukupolu, and that it was, because of the Ha'amoa influence and the Matai prospect. That's one idea. Maui Tegelangi shares that the Tu'ikanukupolu was actually father to son. However, it was a very unstable line. And a lot of reasons behind that is there were about 2 or 3 Tu'ikanukupolu lines that only had one child. And therefore, when it was only one child to inherit, and that happens 2 times, there's not a wider pool of the family when there's no heir to fill into the gaps. And that led to instability, and therefore a voting system kind of materialized to try and provide more stability, because there was not a lot of confidence in the ability of the Tu'ikanukupolu line to maintain stability in managing the administration of the government of the Tu'itonga Empire. There are examples where the heir apparent of the Tu'ihatakalaua would be installed as the Tu'ikanukupolu to try and provide leadership and stability to the Tu'ikanukupolu line, and then later inheriting the Tu'ihatakalaua line after their service in the Tu'ikanukupolu line. And once again, a lot of that was trying to provide stability in the administration and the management of the government. Here's an interesting question from Legrand. Why didn't the British back the Tu'itonga over the Tu'ikanukupolu line if it were the weakest of the kingly lines? When Cook was in Tonga, who was at the height of the Tongan society, Tu'itonga or Tu'ikanukupolu. Also, where was Ta'atakalaua during those times? Okay. Interesting comments there. Appreciate it, Legrand. So, why didn't the British back the Tu'itonga over the Tu'ikanukupolu line if it were the weakest of the kingly lines? Because from the perspective of the British, political and administrative power was what the British understood, right? If you don't have control over the political and the military, then you don't have quote unquote power. That's the way I would answer that first comment there, Legrand. They looked at the Tu'ikanukupolu as the administrative and the political power. They recognized that as more of the power and the influence. The Tu'itonga was elevated above the Tu'ikanukupolu. However, that was in a religious and in a cultural aspect. And I'll give you this example, Legrand. Even after Tupo the First organized the government of Tonga and was the head of the Tongan government, in the political and in the military sense, yes, King George Tupo the First was in charge. But in any traditional cultural event, George Tupo the First was below the Tu'itonga, Laufiri Tonga. This is why Mr. Aotearoa and us, one of the things that we discuss very heavily is Laufiri Tonga's choice to give Tupo the First a taumafakava, because the Tu'ikanukupolu does not have a taumafakava. A taumafakava is a singular cultural tradition that was only for the Tu'itonga, even though the Tu'itongas was called Furitaunga, but it was a Taumafa Kava in a sense. That's not something you win by war. You inherit that by appointment. And so what's miraculous that happens, and a lot of people make this mistake, they say, oh no, King George Tupou the First defeated Laufiri Tonga in the Battle of Velata. Laufiri Tonga was not the Tu'i Tonga then. He was just a young chief vying for political and military power. Once Laufiri Tonga becomes the Tu'i Tonga, you do not engage in administrative, political, and military entanglements because that is beneath the Tu'i Tonga title. Right? This is why when Tupou the First was uniting all of Tonga, you know one village and one area that Tupou the First never entered? Mu'a, Lapaha. And Mu'a didn't even have defensive fortifications. A lot of the other villages and towns, they had kolotaus, right? Defensive structures. And Tupou the First would just go in and just one by one beat them. He never went into Mu'a. And Mu'a didn't even have a defensive structure. Why? Because that is not the role of the Tu'i Tonga, and the Tu'i Tonga is above that. Okay? So what is miraculous, Legrand, is Laufiri Tonga, for whatever reason, has a different vision for the future of Tonga. He sees Tupou the First, obviously a talented politician, a talented warrior in military, obviously talented in bringing people together to put together coalitions, and understands how to navigate this new threat to Tongan independence, the Western concept of government. Laufiri Tonga then says, I am not going to challenge Tupou the First, and actually, I'm going to empower him. I'm going to give him a kava ceremony, which is the traditional way of receiving power and authority. That's what happened with the first Tu'i Tonga from Tangaloa. That's why there's a kava bowl and the whole discussion of how the kava would be structured, because Tangaloa is signifying to everyone Aho Etu is now who's going to be embodied with power and authority to lead as the leader. Laufiri Tonga does the exact same thing for Tupou the First. He gives Tupou the First a Taumafa Kava and then tells Tupou the First, the Tu'i Tonga line will end with me, right? Because he will have heirs, and he understands that if he doesn't give Tupou the First a kava ceremony, he is handicapped. There's not enough stability. There's always someone vying for power, and the biggest weakness that Tupou the First has is he's from the lowest kingly line and does not have that appointment of the culture and the history behind him. Hopefully that answers that question there. And then the next part is, when Cook was in Tonga, who was at the height of the Tongan society, Tu'i Tonga or Tu'i Kanukupolu? Tu'i Tonga was the height, but the Tu'i Kanukupolu, once again, is the administrative and the political power in charge. Also, where was the Ha'atakalaua during those times? The Tu'i Ha'atakalaua, if you go and read a book by George Vason, there is a discussion of the last Tu'i Ha'atakalaua there, Muriki Ha'amea. He gets killed in a battle, and then out of that instability, the Tu'i Kanukupolu enforces military influence and administrative influence to not have the Tu'i Ha'atakalaua reinstated. And obviously the Tu'i Tonga doesn't get involved in that, but that's what happens, and the Tu'i Ha'atakalaua line doesn't have that influence anymore. However, this is another interesting thing, Legrand. what's the name of the book? It is, just search George Vason, and I think, life amongst the Tongans in Polynesia, but George Vason. So just the name George, and then the last name is V as in Victor, Ason. I want to type it in here into the chat so you can see the name. If you search it up, you'll find it. George Vason. There you go. I just put that in the chat so people have that. Here's there was a thought that I was going to share. Oh, here's an interesting comment to go along with that, Legrand. Is you could make the argument today that it's actually the Tu'i Hatakalaua line that is in power. So when Queen Salote becomes the queen or the monarch of Tonga, there is a huge challenge that she has. Tradition in Tonga is it is the male line that carries the authority, right? And with Tupo II not having a son and his daughter being crowned as queen, there is a real threat to the stability and the capacity of the quote unquote Tupo family to maintain power. It is by design and not by chance that she was arranged to be married with Tungi Mairefihi, because he is the heir. If the Tu'i Hatakalaua was installed from father to son, and was not impeded by the Tu'ikanukupolu and the political and military unrest during that time, Tungi is the rightful heir of the Tu'i Hatakalaua line. So when Queen Salote marries into Tungi, because the traditional way is father to son, one could make the argument that it is the Tu'i Hatakalaua line that is leading in the Tupo family today, because inheritance is through the male line, and since Tungi Mairefihi is the Tu'i Hatakalaua heir and also a very close relative of the Tu'i Tonga, that's why he married to Queen Salote, and that's why that marriage was critical. It solidified or reinstated stability and cultural and historical justification for the current ruling family to maintain its rule. So that would be something that I would kind of give on that. So looks like a follow-up comment. So basically, like today in Tonga, pretty much the king still rules Tonga, but there's a government set in place, 2 different lanes. Does that explain how it was with the 2 back in the days of Tonga? I think I understand your question. That's how it was back in the day, Legrand. But because the last Tu'i Tonga gave Tupo the First a kava ceremony, and in a sense handed the torch off to him, and also because Queen Salote married back into the Tu'i Hatakalaua line, you could say that this is a very stable, and it's still the same family from the Tu'i Tonga ruling to this day. Quick comment here from Josh. Can you one day do a podcast of East Polynesian, have a closer DNA and language matches to people in central northern outliers in Solomon Islands than to Samoa? Let me see if I can copy and paste this comment. How can I do this? Let me try and do something with that, Josh. Let me put this in Polynesian Eyes Podcast at Gmail. If you could send, I can't copy it right now off of the platform we're using, Josh. If you could just copy and paste your comment in an email, I can follow up with it. If you also have any guests that you think would be very beneficial for us to invite to talk through this, Josh, send us that recommendation. And if you know their contact, send it over, and we can just kind of have that discussion on that as a potential topic. So I appreciate that, Josh. Let's see. All right, perfect. Let's try and close out our AI podcast here and close out the show for today.
It involves weaving influential Samoan lineage into the very fabric of the Tongan power structure. Some historians even suggest this led to a sort of Samoanized governance and culture in Tonga over time.
So the whole relationship between Tonga and Samoa, it shifts from direct imperial rule to something much more complex. Political independence for Samoa, but alongside these enduring kinship ties and significant mutual influence.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how history reshapes power dynamics, transforms relationships long term.
It really is. The whole story of the Tuitong Empire's influence in Samoa and that rebellion, it just gives such a compelling picture of the complex interplay of power, culture, identity in pre-colonial Polynesia.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history is rarely simple, and even conflict can lead to new kinds of connection and mutual shaping.
Well said.
So, just to quickly wrap up our deep dive today, we've journeyed through the rise and pretty extensive reach of the Tuitonga Empire, its centuries long influence in Samoa, the pivotal Samoan rebellion led by legends like Tuna, Fada, and the amazing Lumasui,
Tuna and fada.
and the enduring significance of Tuitonga Talakaifeki's fateful words, birthing the Malatoa title. It's such a powerful story, really highlighting that deeply interwoven history of Tonga and Samoa.
And it powerfully underscores that their relationship, yeah, it had conflict, it had dominance, but it's also fundamentally rooted in these deep kinship ties.
Yeah.
That connection, often beautifully expressed with the term takusa.
Takuto, right.
This shared history has just profoundly shaped the cultural, the political identities of both nations. It leaves this lasting legacy of connection, mutual influence that still resonates today.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the enduring power of oral traditions, historical events, and shaping a nation's identity, its collective memory, not just in Samoa and Tonga, but across all cultures. Think about that vital role language and titles play, preserving and transmitting history from one generation to the next. That's definitely your food for thought this time. Mallow, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Played next
Malo,
to Dwayne Johnson.
No, he
correct?
played behind.
So
Hey, how would you like to?
let me this is pretty cool. I appreciate so everybody can maybe check them out, subscribe to them. It's always cool to support other content creators here, but it's Inative Creative. It looks like they do, they're looks like they're from Ha'amoa. They do a lot of Ha'amoa news, legends, and so forth, politics in Ha'amoa. So kind of interesting. I enjoyed that. So I subscribe to them just to see what other kind of stories that they bring up. So appreciate that. With that being said, we are bringing to a close another live digital kava session here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast. Appreciate everyone's comments, the interactions online. Apologize we weren't able to get to every question and every comment just because of the volume of the comments, but we tried to get as much engagement and involvement from people online. You know what, guys? Here's one thing. We're going to close with this. April was our most interactive month of all time for the podcast, and especially on YouTube. Typically we get a lot of our engagement on TikTok, and that's usually been our kind of most interactive comments, shares, and so forth, and views. April, for whatever reason, was just off the charts. I mean, I'm talking about triple to quadruple of our views, comments, and so forth. So really appreciate everyone's willingness to comment, share, subscribe. It goes a long way. We're steadily reaching towards hopefully one day we'll get a better mic. It's either that or I need to tone down my voice. I get it. Seems like it's kind of getting out of control here, but great month. We're marching towards 1,000 subscribers, marching on YouTube. We're getting close to, I think we're marching towards 2,000, maybe 3,000, 2 or 3,000 on TikTok. But really appreciate everyone's feedback and on the comments. Once again, as always, our position is we are one people. We have always been one people. We are, in many ways, still one nation, though we've been kind of sliced and diced, and we have different flags and we have different governments. But that doesn't change the fact that we are all related, literally, physically related, and then also we share the same cultural, religious, and kind of traditional belief systems. And it's really important that more of our people have these conversations, to really just deep dive, have conversations, and really explore what our ancestors did. I really do believe, our Polynesian people are going to turn the corner. I feel like we're going to have we already have a huge impact on the world. Overall, I know the most obvious one is in sports, but we're spreading into entertainment, we're spreading into politics, we're spreading into content creation, and for a small group of people who lived on small specks of land on the largest ocean, it's miraculous. We definitely have a lot to contribute to this world, and a big place to start to do that is to have more conversations, help us understand the great history that we share, that will hopefully drive us together to be more unified, because the more unified we are, the greater the impact we'll have in the culture of the world overall. I think we will bring a lot of stability and bring back a lot of the craziness that we see out there. With that being said, as always, be bold. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. And until next time, peace.